Hey everyone, it's Sevi and I'm back with another Honkai Star Rail video, this time on team building for beginners. So this basic beginner's guide to team building is going to cover the main considerations to keep when making a team, such as team roles, elemental coverage, and certain synergies that you can pay attention to. Anyway, let's just dive into it. The first topic I want to talk about are your team roles, and the first main consideration is how are you going to keep your team alive? There are two paths that specialize in this, and this is the abundance path and the preservation path. So the abundance path is kind of like your healer class, and then the preservation path is kind of your shielding, tanking class. And I would consider this first because your means of survival and outlasting battles is quite crucial. If you are playing simulated universe content especially, and you can't build that many characters yet, you're likely investing into one team for now, and you can't easily replace units in the middle, so that team really needs to survive for the entire run. Also, this isn't like in Genshin where you can just compensate the absence of a healer or a shielder by dodging or iframing really well, because in Honkai Star Rail, the enemies are going to hit you. There are also cases where with enough damage, you can outdamage your enemies, you can crowd control them, you can continuously break your enemy's toughness so that they keep delaying their turns, they barely have a chance to get damage in. Unless the content is specifically catered to that, there won't be a lot of opportunities where that will happen, to be honest. So even when you are considering a certain class of units such as destruction units, some destruction units can have a way to heal themselves. For example, Arlen. He has a bonus ability that allows him to heal himself. Even though he has that, that generally might not be enough to sustain him, much less the entire team if the rest of your team also takes damage. So let's consider how we're going to keep the team alive. Our options for these roles are very limited right now. For free-to-plays, your default option for a shielder or preservation unit is March 7th, and then your default abundance option is Natasha. I have personally been running Natasha more rather than March 7th, but there is a case for either units depending on your teammates, depending on other synergies, and especially if you are considering certain elemental counters. For example, you might be going up against enemies that have an ice weakness, then that would encourage you to play March 7th more than Natasha. Considering the standard 5 stars, Bailu is a super good healer. She does everything better than Natasha, really, not considering their different elements. So if you have Bailu, then you can generally stick with her and feel comfortable investing in her. Transitioning to Japard though, as your main preservation unit might be slightly trickier since his shielding is from his ultimate and his technique, which means that you need to get his energy up consistently in order to make his shielding feel comfortable enough or spend his technique point before major battles. Can you run both an abundance and a preservation unit at the same time? Or can you run 2 preservation units or run 2 abundance units? Technically you can for ultimate comfort. There's nothing really stopping you from doing that, but it can compromise your damage a lot, and that is an important consideration when it comes for harder content. For your next role, the next slot that you want to fill is your DPS slot. So the main classes that you want to pay attention to for DPS slots are the Hunt, Erudition, and Destruction. Now, a quick overview of what sets them apart. The Hunt characters are really good at single target damage and utilizing speed buffs. Erudition units are really good for multi-target and AoE damage. And then Destruction units can go either way depending on their kit, but Destruction units generally have more tanking power than the Hunt or Erudition classes. Choosing your DPS in particular can largely depend on who you like or who you want to main. It can also depend on the content you're trying to tackle. If you're going up against a boss with this particular weakness and you really want a DPS that can exploit that weakness as much as possible. And you can go with either one DPS slot, or you can actually bring in 2 DPS slots. For example, I could take Clara, a destruction unit, and I could take Zila as the Hunt unit. If you are choosing 2 DPS slots, you can find different ways for them to complement each other. In this case, by having a Clara destruction unit, she can do multi-target damage. Complementing her with Zila the Hunt, she focuses on single target damage. So you kind of have both of those covered. That's one way of pairing them together. You could also go with two the Hunt characters. That is entirely possible. Against mobs, against waves of several enemies, if you have the buffs and the setup to make your Hunt DPSs pick off the enemies quickly, exploit those speed buffs, then it could work. It could be an effective way of fighting. If you are going up against a boss, for example, with these weaknesses of your Hunt units in particular, then that would be a good scenario for your Hunt units to shine. But then there are some scenarios where having two Hunt units might not be super great. You could also go with two multi-target or two Erudition units, such as Herta and Himiko here, and these might make farming runs feel faster since they will be going and sawing through waves of enemies quite efficiently, since that is what they specialize in. So again, having your DPS slot or two DPS slots, this is kind of a matter of mix and matching. This can be an it depends scenario where you're trying to match them up to the battle, the enemies you're trying to face, who you want to main, different factors such as those. But generally, you want to be a bit observant in determining what might be better against a certain wave of enemies. Now you might be asking, can you have 3 DPS units in your team and just 1 healer? Well, technically you can. That is totally possible, nothing is stopping you, but there are other uses for your slots that you can definitely consider. So another role that you want to consider is your Harmony or Nihility paths. Harmony units are those that can give buffs to your allies, and Nihility paths are those that can give debuffs to enemies. So I do suggest having at least one of these in your team because it can increase the entire team's damage, or it can particularly increase the damage of your DPS, or it can debuff the enemy such that your entire team can take advantage of that debuff on that certain enemy. So let's take Asta for example. She's a Harmony unit and she has a team-wide attack and speed buff. Another example is Pella, who is a Nihility character, and Pella can remove enemy buffs and also reduce enemy defense, and that means your entire team can benefit from attacking a debuffed enemy. Another interesting unit is Sampo, who is a Nihility character, and Sampo can make enemies more vulnerable to damage over time effects, which synergizes well with damage over time teammates. There can also be cases where you will have 2 buffers, or 1 buffer and 1 debuffer, and they will both support 1 DPS unit, and then that unit ends up acting as some sort of hyper carry. I did this one team in early access beta with Zila being supported by Bronya and Pella, and it turned out really well because Bronya was buffing Zila, Pella was debuffing enemies for Zila, so the combined buffs and debuffs made Zila just get really good damage output overall. I also kind of want to emphasize that Harmony or Nihility units, they don't always just debuff or buff, because some of them have good breaking utility, some of them actually have good damage utility. For example, Asta, whose skill deals 5 instances of fire damage, and this can be really good up against enemies that are weak to fire because it means further depletion against their toughness bar. There's also Sampo, who, as I said, makes enemies more vulnerable to damage over time, but Sampo also deals multi-target damage himself. He also deals damage over time himself. So in summary, having 1 slot for abundance or preservation is very important, and it's generally enough to just have 1 slot dedicated to that role. And then pick your DPS, and then for the other 2 slots, you can go with roles that complement your first 2 units further, which is either going for maybe another DPS or going for a Harmony/Nihility character. Choosing those in particular can definitely depend on the content you're trying to tackle or the enemies you're trying to fight, since it is weaknesses that you are trying to address. As a bonus tip, the team arrangement is also important, and this is for 2 main reasons. First of all, some characters have taunt abilities or a higher chance of getting hit due to their path. This is due to a hidden taunt stat that paths have by default. Like Hunt and Erudition paths have lower taunt stats compared to Destruction and Preservation paths. The other main reason is because some enemies have multi-target damage, or they have attacks that have splash damage actually. In a battle, you might have an enemy that targets Clara, but then the splash damage also hits Danheng and Asta. So if I were to arrange this team properly, it would look something like this. Out of these 4, Clara is going to be the one aggroing enemies towards her. She has taunt built into her kit. Since enemies are going to be attacking her more often, the only character I would want to put in that line of fire, if ever, is Natasha, because Natasha's a healer. She likes to build HP for that healing to scale off of, so she will generally be able to soak up a little more damage compared to her other teammates. So generally, I would put your tanking or taunting units at the edge of the team arrangement and away from your squishier units, so that when enemies do hit those tanky or taunting units, if they ever have splash damage or if they're ever multi-target, then they will stay away from your squishy units in general. So now that we have covered team roles as a major consideration, another huge thing is elemental coverage, where enemies have certain elemental weaknesses that you want to take advantage of. And you want to build a team that can basically cover a lot of enemy scenarios going into the content you're facing. So taking this team, for example, I have Clara and Natasha, who are both physical units. I have Asta, who's a fire unit, and I have Danhung, who is a wind unit. So they will be able to efficiently tackle enemies who are weak to physical, fire, and wind. If I wanted to expand this elemental coverage a bit more, I could have March 7th, and then that would add elemental coverage towards ice weaknesses. In general, I wouldn't recommend doing more than 2 units for one type of damage. So this team with Clara and Natasha being both physical damage units, I would still consider this okay, because even if I'm losing out on one potential elemental coverage, I still like using these two together as sustain and damage dealers respectively. However, I would find it quite iffy if I replaced Asta here with another physical unit, and then that gives me 3 physical characters and 1 wind character, and elemental coverage wise, this would be a bit problematic. The only time I would really consider something like this is if I'm trying to counter an enemy with this particular weakness. But again, it is going to make it more difficult to counter other potential scenarios outside of that specific enemy scenario. As you move forward in the game, you will likely end up building characters of different elements to help you tackle various enemy scenarios, but at least in early game, this might not necessarily be the case, since each enemy does have multiple weaknesses that you will likely be able to make use of. So at this point, we have discussed teammate roles and elemental coverage, and just using these 2 basic considerations or these 2 basic guidelines, you will already pretty much be able to construct cohesive teams. But if you want to go a little further than that, an extra step that you could do is considering unit-specific synergies. And when I say unit-specific, I mean like building a team that really considers the needs of certain units you are putting in there, like building a team around a certain character or building a team that makes use of a particular synergy between 2 characters, things like that. If you want to build a team around a character, then you need to get a sense of what will service them and what won't. So that also necessitates understanding how their kit works. Let's take Clara. Clara gets a lot of damage from delivering her counter attacks when she gets hit. Now this changes when she has her ultimate up, because at least under the condition of her ultimate, even if it's her allies that get hit, she will still give those counter attacks. But generally, when you have Clara on the team, you want to aggro enemies to her, and you also need to sustain her. So she's going to need teammates that help with that. I find March 7th to be a particularly good teammate for Clara. March's shield, when applied to an ally, actually makes enemies aggro towards the ally with the shield. When a shielded ally is attacked, March 7th also attacks the enemy. So let's say that March applies her shield to Clara, then that further ensures that enemies will be attacking Clara. Another example would be damage over time teams. So Sampo is a damage over time dealer, and he also debuffs enemies to increase the strength of damage over time effects. So one really good way to use him is to comp him with another damage over time focused teammate, Serval or Hook, who deal shock and burn damage respectively. Another particular synergy that I liked was pairing Zila with Bronya. Zila innately already has a passive that gives her an extra turn, which makes it possible to chain multiple attacks with her ultimate, her extra turn, while Bronya's skill advances a unit's turn and then also buffs with her ultimate. So if you combine Bronya with Zila, then Zila ends up inserting so many many of her own turns in between enemy turns that they will die before they even get a chance to attack you. So those are some examples of the particular synergies you can pay attention to. Of course, if there is a particular character you want to focus on, then again, you want to read their character kits and figure out what kind of utilities or what kind of buffs will service them. You also want to be able to understand weakness break effects in general and overall figure out how to make the best use of your limited selection. Oftentimes, if you can observe these things or learn these things about character kits, then you can put 2 and 2 together and realize how some units are able to synergize really well together. If you want a rundown of what other character kits are like, or what character kits to watch out for, you can check out my previous Honkai Star Rail video where I did a full character roundup of those that are available upon launch, and I talked about their kits and summarized them a bit for you. So that's going to be it for this basic team building video. And again, these are general guidelines and tips, because once we start considering the additional synergies that certain equipment can bring in, such as light cones and relics, then team building can get a little bit more complex. They can become a little bit more specific. Anyway, let me know in the comments what team you have built, what team you are maining, or what team you hope to main. I would really love to know, especially since we are starting this Honkai Star Rail journey together. That's going to be all for this video. If it helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!